Welcome to Podkey Wellness, where today it's hormones, fertility, menopause, and the mind itself. A lot of women's health advice still treats life in disconnected chapters. Puberty over here, fertility over there, menopause way off in the distance. The more useful picture is that it's one continuous hormonal story, and what happens early can shape bone health, metabolism, cardiovascular risk, and quality of life, much later on. That continuum idea is one of the biggest takeaways here. Hormonal change doesn't start at perimenopause. It starts at puberty and keeps going, influencing basically every organ system along the way. And once you look at it that way, care becomes more anticipatory. You're not waiting for a crisis. You're thinking earlier about lifestyle screening and treatment that might lower later risks like bone loss or metabolic disease. On contraception, the arrival of reliable oral contraceptives in the 1970s was a genuine societal shift. It gave women much more control over when to have children, and that had huge effects on education and careers. It's also worth clearing up one stubborn myth. Birth control pills do not cause infertility. They suppress ovulation while you're taking them, but they don't age the ovaries. And fertility usually returns within about a month after stopping. Natural or rhythm-style methods sound appealing to some people, but they're much less reliable, especially if cycles are irregular, and they don't somehow preserve fertility better than hormonal methods. If somebody needs contraception for 5 years or more, long-acting reversible options like IUDs, implants, the copper IUD or Depo-Provera tend to work better in real life because they remove user error. If pregnancy is planned within a year, pills may make more sense because they're easier to start and stop. Fertility itself still follows biology, no matter how good our calendars and apps get. Peak female fertility is in the late teens through late 20s, with a sharper decline after about 35%. That's part of why egg freezing is often considered most strategic in the late 20s to early 30s. It's a balance between getting a better egg yield and not doing it so early that many people may never actually need those eggs. And infertility isn't just a female issue. Up to about half of infertility cases involve male factors. Even when standard testing looks normal, people often end up with the label unexplained infertility. But IVF and ICSI remain real options. Two conditions that still frustrate a lot of patients, and clinicians are PCOS and endometriosis. With PCOS, some groups have tried rebranding it as polyendocrine metabolic syndrome, or PMOS. The name is trying to reflect the broader metabolic piece, but the diagnostic criteria haven't changed, and it hasn't unlocked some new cause or treatment. That's really the hard truth with PCOS. Despite a lot of research, the underlying cause still isn't settled, so management remains focused on controlling metabolic and endocrine symptoms. Endometriosis is a different kind of challenge. It affects about 1 in 10 women, often causes painful periods along with bowel or bladder symptoms, and is still underdiagnosed, with an average delay of 7 to 9 years. Part of the problem is that many lesions are too small to show up on imaging, so definitive diagnosis often requires laparoscopy, and sometimes symptoms get treated one at a time without recognizing the systemic pattern underneath. Hot flashes also deserve a lot more respect than they usually get. Severe or frequent hot flashes are associated with higher risks of cardiovascular disease, hypertension, and type 2 diabetes. The likely links include sleep disruption and metabolic stress, which makes sense if you've ever talked to someone who's been jolted awake over and over for months. Bad sleep has a way of making everything more expensive. There are also important disparities here. Black women tend to experience hot flashes earlier, more intensely, and for longer, which may put them at higher cardiometabolic risk during perimenopause and afterward. Those disparities also line up with broader patterns, including higher dementia and Alzheimer's rates, raising questions about how hormonal change, chronic stress, and systemic bias may interact to worsen aging-related outcomes. On treatment, modern low-dose hormone replacement therapy is FDA-approved and considered safe for most women when started early in perimenopause. It can relieve hot flashes, improve mood and sleep, and help counter weight gain. Starting earlier appears to matter. The long-term benefits are greater for cardiovascular health, bone density, and overall quality of life. And there's no mandated time limit on how long a woman can remain on therapy. Bone health is a major piece of this. Estrogen replacement is the only medication with an FDA indication specifically for preventing postmenopausal osteoporosis. And starting it soon after menopause can stop the rapid bone loss that often happens in the first 5 years. That's why there's a strong argument for getting a baseline bone density scan right after menopause instead of waiting until 65. A lot of bone loss is silent, and by the time it gets noticed, years may have passed. Then there's the very unglamorous but extremely useful stuff: resistance and weight training, plus adequate calcium and vitamin D. Mechanical loading helps stimulate bone remodeling, while stronger muscles also lower fracture risk. Sometimes the boring basics are doing heavy lifting, literally. A helpful distinction here is vaginal versus systemic estrogen. Vaginal estrogen is local treatment for genitourinary syndrome of menopause, things like dryness, urinary urgency, and recurrent UTIs, and it usually has minimal systemic effects. Systemic estrogen, whether it's oral, a patch, spray, or gel, is what treats whole body symptoms like hot flashes. It's also the form with the FDA indication for osteoporosis prevention. The other half of today's roundup moves from hormones to consciousness, and the central idea is a little wild at first. The feeling of an inner observer, that quiet little I in the middle of experience, is better understood as an illusion than a separate entity. In this view, meditation helps dissolve the usual split between observer and observed. Instead of imagining a watcher standing apart from thoughts and feelings, you notice that thoughts, sensations, and awareness are all part of one continuous field of experience. That sounds abstract, but the practical point is simple. When a thought shows up, you can notice it as a thought without automatically becoming it. That creates freedom around emotion, because you can see how thoughts trigger feelings and choose how long to stay entangled. There's a Tibetan metaphor for this. Thoughts are like thieves entering an empty house. If there's no solid little self to rob, they lose some of their power. For beginners, that can be a very calming reframe when the mind gets noisy instead of serene. And noisy is normal. Focused attention is surprisingly fragile. Many people can't sustain simple focus for even 30 seconds without mind wandering, which tells you how much internal chatter is running in the background. With more intensive practice, people often report a kind of higher perceptual frame rate, noticing more sensory and emotional detail moment to moment. That undermines the idea that there's one central spotlight controlling everything. Meditation, in this framing, is less about adding something special and more about cessation. You're learning to stop the habitual self-talk and mental proliferation that keeps suffering running on a loop. Evolution didn't exactly hand us an off switch for self-talk, so if sustained well-being is the goal, some kind of deliberate practice is probably necessary. Psychedelics can sometimes act as a catalyst here. An intense experience, even an anecdotal one like MDMA, may convince someone that very different states of mind are possible and spark a serious interest in meditation or first-person exploration. But the key point is integration. Psychedelic insight tends to be temporary. Lasting benefit comes from bringing those insights into ordinary waking life through regular practice, not from chasing the experience itself. That connects to the final theme: goal versus process. Achievement can feel great, but usually only for a while. Then the mind manufactures a fresh to-do list and calls it destiny. So the recommendation is to build the capacity to be present for the activity itself, to find fulfillment in the process rather than staking well-being entirely on outcomes. It's a useful counterweight in health, work, and pretty much everything else humans love to overcomplicate. That's the roundup for today from Podkey Wellness. Take care of your future self, and maybe your present attention span too. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.